Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the chaos of my daily life. I was used to the grind of city living, waking up to the sound of honking horns, crowded subways, the endless hum of streetlights, and the constant pressure of deadlines. I needed something quieter, something that would ground me, help me feel alive again. I've always been an outdoor person, someone who finds peace in nature. Hiking, camping, photography, you name it. I've done it. So when I stumbled across an old trail on a map one afternoon, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to spend a few days by myself in the Sierra Nevada mountains, far away from everything that reminded me of the concrete jungle. I had been on solo hikes before, but this one felt different. It was a less known path, almost forgotten, leading into the heart of the mountains. The trailhead was small, almost invisible, unless you knew where to look. That in itself was a draw for me. I loved getting off the beaten path, exploring places others never ventured to. It was late in the afternoon when I parked my car by the trail. The sun was starting its slow descent behind the towering pines, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp, and I could smell the earthy scent of pine needles and damp leaves. I adjusted the straps on my backpack and started off, the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and rocks echoing in the stillness of the woods. At first, everything felt perfect. The trail wound gently through the trees, the soft murmur of a nearby stream filling the air. I snapped a few pictures as I went, capturing the sunlight filtering through the canopy, the way it made the leaves glow in shades of amber and gold. It was beautiful, peaceful in a way that made me feel completely removed from the world I had left behind. But as the afternoon wore on, I started to notice that something wasn't quite right. The trail wasn't as well marked as I thought it would be. There were no signs or arrows indicating where to go next, just faint tracks in the dirt that seemed to vanish every few hundred yards. I didn't let it bother me at first. After all, I had hiked off trails before, and getting lost wasn't something I was unfamiliar with. But then the woods started to feel different. There was a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't the usual sense of quiet you get in the wilderness. No, this was something else. A heavy stillness had settled in. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, the rustling of leaves, but there was no chirping of birds, no animals scampering in the underbrush. It was as though all the creatures had vanished. My steps slowed as I looked around. It was almost as if the forest itself had grown quieter, holding its breath. I felt a knot form in my stomach, the first flutter of unease beginning to rise. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, even though there was no sign of life. I glanced down at my map. The trail seemed to be leading me deeper into the forest, but there was something strange about it. According to the map, the trail was supposed to be a loop that would bring me back to the main path after a couple of miles. But I was now well beyond the distance I had expected to travel, and the path wasn't looking like it was going to back anytime soon. The map was old, faded, and maybe I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, but I couldn't remember exactly when. I checked my phone, no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. I knew that when I left. But still, the realization made me feel isolated in a way I hadn't expected. I had relied on my map and compass, but now those seemed almost useless in the vastness of the wilderness. A creeping doubt settled over me. Had I gone too far? I pushed the thought out of my mind and decided to keep moving. I wasn't lost yet, just off track. I could always turn back when I found a good point of reference. So I kept walking, my boots grinding against the dirt with each step, my eyes scanning the trees, trying to pick out any familiar landmarks that might guide me back. It was just as the light was beginning to fade that I saw it. A break in the trees. Something just didn't look right. Through the thinning canopy, I caught a glimpse of a structure. My first thought was that it was a cabin or shelter, maybe some kind of hunter's shack, left behind by people who had once lived here. But it was old, weathered, and barely visible through the dense underbrush. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it, but then the shape became clearer, and I realized it was definitely there. I made my way toward it, wondering if it could be a good place to rest for the night, or at least get a better sense of where I was. I wasn't in a rush. The sun had almost set, and I needed to find shelter before it got too dark. The temperature was dropping quickly, and I knew that out here in the mountains, it could get dangerously cold after sundown. As I drew closer, I could see more details. The cabin was small, built with rough-hewn logs, but it was falling apart. The roof sagged under the weight of time, and the walls had been warped by years of exposure to the elements. The windows were boarded up, the wood old and warped, and a sense of neglect clung to it like a shroud. For some reason, a knot tightened in my stomach again. It wasn't just the cabin itself, it was the way it sat in the woods, so isolated, so abandoned. There was something unnerving about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself walking toward the door. I paused in front of it. The door was a weathered wooden slab, chipped and peeling. The wood looked dry, cracked, and brittle, as if it might break off with a strong gust of wind. I hesitated for a moment. I had never seen a cabin this secluded before. I had hiked in remote places, but this felt different. But there was something compelling about it, an urge I couldn't ignore. Maybe it was the photographer in me, the desire to explore, to capture the forgotten and the unseen. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The sound was sharp, cutting through the quiet of the woods. As I stepped inside, I immediately felt a chill. It wasn't the kind of cold that comes from the weather. It was something deeper, a kind of cold that seeped into your bones. The cabin was dark, save for the slivers of fading light that filtered through the cracks in the boards. It was thick with dust, untouched for years. The smell of mildew and rot hit me, the air stale and heavy with age. My eyes scanned the room, and that's when I saw them. Animal bones. They were hanging from the ceiling, strung up by thin ropes and wires. A collection of small skulls, animal limbs, and fur pelts adorned the beams, creating a macabre display. It looked like something you would expect to see in a hunting lodge or maybe a trapper's cabin, but the way they were arranged, so deliberately, felt wrong. It felt off. I stepped further into the room, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. I could see more details now. Ripped clothing scattered around the room, old tools left haphazardly on the floor, and the small wooden table in the center of the room. At first glance, it seemed normal, but as I approached, I noticed something alarming. A hunting knife was embedded deep into the table, its blade gleaming in the dim light. It was so forcefully driven in that it looked almost like it had been used in a frenzy. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the unease I had pushed aside earlier now creeping into my thoughts. Something wasn't right about this place. I took another step forward, my eyes catching on the floor beneath me. Deep, jagged marks marred the wooden planks, scratches, gouges, and what looked like claw marks. They weren't from an animal. I knew that. These weren't random, natural marks left by a bear or a wolf. They were deliberate, like something had been dragged across the floor over and over again. That's when I heard it. The door slammed shut behind me, a deafening noise that made me freeze in place. I turned sharply, heart pounding in my chest. The door had been open when I stepped in, but now it was shut tight. I rushed to it, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The bolt had slid into place from the outside. Panic surged through me, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. My heart raced, and for the first time I felt a real sense of fear. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I was trapped. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the sound of my heart beating in time with the frantic thoughts racing through my mind. My hands shook as I tried the door again, throwing my weight against it with all my strength, but it didn't budge. The bolt was locked from the outside, solid, secure, impenetrable. I stepped back from the door, my eyes flicking around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The walls were bare, except for a few old hooks and more animal bones hanging from the beams. The air was thick with dust, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I needed to think. I needed to stay calm. But everything about this place felt wrong. It was as if the room itself was closing in on me. I glanced at the table again, where that hunting knife was still embedded deep in the wood, almost as though it was waiting for something or someone. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I moved away from the door, pacing around the cabin, trying to assess my options. There had to be another way out, right? Maybe a window, a back door, something. But as I turned toward the far corner of the room, my stomach lurched. The floor was covered in something dark, stains, big uneven patches of dark brown and black that soaked into the cracks between the wooden boards. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. Blood. Old blood. And I wasn't imagining it. There were signs of something being dragged across the floor, leading toward a darkened alcove at the back of the cabin. It didn't take much imagination to know that something or someone had been held in here. The walls, too, had dark stains on them. I couldn't tell how old they were, but they looked like they'd been there for a long time. The edges were jagged, faded in places like dried blood. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up even more. I had to get out. This wasn't just a secluded cabin. This was something else, something dangerous. I wasn't sure if it was a hunting cabin or something far darker. I turned to look at the window. There was one up high on the wall opposite me. It was covered in heavy wooden boards nailed in place, but I didn't care. I needed a way out. I dropped to my knees and started pulling at the boards with my hands, desperately trying to pry them loose. My fingers scraped against the rough wood, and I felt the edges of the nails biting into my skin as I tugged and yanked, but they wouldn't move. My hands were shaking. Panic had set in, but I couldn't stop. I could feel the sweat on my skin, my breath shallow and erratic. I wasn't thinking clearly. I had to get out. I wasn't alone in here. I knew that much. There was something out there, something that had put me in this situation. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, it was just a faint sound, like someone walking through dry leaves, but it was getting closer. My heart leapt into my throat and I froze, not daring to move. I pressed myself against the wall, my eyes fixed on the door, my breath held. The footsteps stopped right outside the cabin. I could feel the air thickening with tension. Every muscle in my body coiled tight, waiting. Then, the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. The click echoed through the cabin, louder than anything I had ever heard. A cold, hollow sound. I didn't need to see the man outside to know who it was. I had been hearing his footsteps, hearing his movements for the past few minutes. He had been circling the cabin, listening, watching. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. There was no way I was going to survive if he came inside. I was trapped. This was no longer just an eerie cabin in the woods. It was a prison, a death trap. I had to find a way to fight back, to survive. Frantically, I looked around the room. My eyes darted to the corner where the pile of torn clothing was heaped. I moved toward it, my legs unsteady beneath me. There was something buried beneath the clothes, something metallic. I bent down and reached for it, my fingers brushing against cold, rusted metal. It was a crowbar half buried under the fabric. I grabbed it, feeling its weight in my hands, the roughness of its surface under my fingertips. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I didn't know what I would do with it, but it gave me some small sense of hope. I looked around again. The walls, the windows, the door, everything was locked down tight. I could hear him moving outside again, slow and deliberate, as if he knew I was in here, as if he were savoring the moment. The sound of his boots crunching over the dirt outside made my skin crawl. He was toying with me. He was playing some twisted game. But I wouldn't just sit here and wait for him to come in. No, I couldn't. I wouldn't. I made my way toward the back wall, searching for any crack or crevice that might offer an escape. The window was still my best bet, but it was nearly impossible to get to. I had to try. With the crowbar in hand, I knelt down and pried at the boards once more. This time the nails creaked, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. I pulled harder, my muscles straining as I wrenched the boards loose, one by one. The scraping sound echoed in the silence, making my teeth grind together in anxiety. Then, just as I thought I had made a small gap, I heard him again, the faint sound of his footsteps approaching the door. Closer, closer. I had to hurry. Finally, with one last tug, the last board came loose. A hole, just big enough for me to fit through. I had no time to waste. I climbed to my feet, clutching the crowbar tightly in my hand, my heart hammering in my chest. The window was within reach now. I could see the outside, the dark woods beyond, and I knew I had only one chance to escape. The door rattled. I could hear him outside, testing the handle. I had to move. Now. I took a deep breath, gathered all the strength I had left, and shoved the crowbar into the frame. The nails groaned as I worked them loose. I could hear the man's breathing now, heavy, just outside the door. I didn't wait. I threw myself through the window. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards spraying in every direction, some embedding themselves into my arms and legs. I didn't care. I didn't even feel it. Adrenaline shot through me, pushing past the sharp pain. I pushed myself out of the frame, tumbling into the dirt below. The moment I hit the ground, I sprang to my feet, my legs shaking from the effort. I didn't waste a second to check for injuries or even pause to catch my breath. I just ran. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and biting, but I barely noticed. The forest around me was dark, too dark, pitch black except for the faint light of the stars peeking through the canopy above. The ground was uneven, rocks and roots jutting out of the earth, but I didn't care. I barreled forward, my feet tripping over the underbrush, branches whipping against my face, but I pushed through it all, my mind focused on one thing: escape. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of boots crunching against the leaves, growing louder. He was following me. I could feel it, the weight of his presence pressing on my back, like a shadow that would never leave. I didn't dare look back. I just ran faster, my lungs burning with each breath, my muscles screaming in protest, but I couldn't stop. Not now. A distant sound echoed through the trees, a rifle cocking again. The crack of the trigger, splitting the air. I heard the whizzing of the bullet just before it passed by me. It missed, but barely. The force of it made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. He was closing the distance. He was going to catch me. But then, through the trees ahead, I saw it. A break in the woods. A clearing. A road. My heart pounded in my chest as the sight of it filled me with a sudden burst of hope. I couldn't see the road clearly, but I knew it was close. If I could just make it there, maybe someone would be on the road. Maybe I could flag them down. I pushed my body harder, ignoring the pain, ignoring the exhaustion. I didn't know how long I'd been running, but it felt like hours. My breath was ragged, my vision blurring from the sweat stinging my eyes. I didn't care. I broke through the trees and into the clearing. And then, just as I thought I might collapse from the strain, I saw it. The headlights of a car. 2 bright beams cutting through the darkness. I didn't hesitate. I didn't even think. I ran straight toward the car, my legs barely keeping up with the pace. The car screeched to a halt in the middle of the road, the driver's face full of shock and confusion. I could barely hear what they said. I don't even remember if they spoke to me or if I just screamed for help. All I knew was that they were there. I was no longer alone. The driver fumbled with their phone, dialing for help. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, still unable to comprehend what had just happened. I could hear the distant sound of footsteps behind me, slow but steady. The man was coming. He was close. But when the car came to a screeching halt, the hunter stopped too. He didn't dare step onto the road as if he knew the car's presence would draw too much attention. I couldn't see his face. He was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel his gaze on me, cold, calculating. A part of me thought for a second that he would take a shot, that he would come after me anyway. But then he simply stood there watching and then vanished in the wilderness. The police arrived soon after. I don't remember much of what happened next, just flashes of blue and red lights, the constant buzzing of voices, and the sensation of being pulled into a world of safety. But nothing felt safe. Not anymore. I tried to explain everything to the officers. I told them about the cabin, about the hunter, about the blood and the chains and the twisted feeling of being watched. But when we returned to the cabin, it was as if nothing had ever happened. The place was empty. No bones, no blood, no signs of a struggle. The cabin looked exactly the way it had when I first found it, run down, abandoned, and silent. I couldn't believe it. I stood in the doorway, staring at the empty room, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. The police searched the area, but they found nothing. No traces of anyone ever having been there. No signs of any struggle. It was as if the entire place had been emptied, erased, scrubbed from existence. I even tried to lead them back to the path I took, but it was like everything had shifted. The woods were different now, less familiar. The landscape had changed. The officers dismissed it as a figment of my imagination, a result of stress and exhaustion. They told me I had probably stumbled onto an old hunting cabin and got scared. But deep down, I knew. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. I never went back to that place, and I never will. Since that night, I haven't gone into the wilderness alone again. In fact, I've avoided the woods entirely. Every time I even catch a glimpse of the trees, that gnawing feeling comes rushing back. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted. It's strange how the mind works sometimes, isn't it? How, after a long stretch of time spent grinding away at life, work, relationships, the daily grind, you can find yourself suddenly yearning for silence, for the absence of people, for the kind of peace that only nature can give. That's what I was looking for when I found the cabin. It wasn't that I didn't have a good life, because I did. But after a particularly rough year, one filled with too many late nights at the office, too many meaningless conversations, and too much noise in my head, I felt like I was suffocating. I needed to escape. So I took some time off work, scoured the internet, and eventually stumbled across a listing for a tiny cabin tucked deep in the forests of Northern California. The listing boasted peace and solitude, no neighbors for miles, a perfect retreat for anyone looking to get away from the world. The photos of the cabin were beautiful, surrounded by tall old pines with nothing but nature as far as the eye could see. A small, simple structure far removed from the modern world. A place where I could clear my head, do some thinking, and just breathe. I didn't waste any time booking it. I made the decision quickly, almost without thinking. Maybe it was impulsive, but I was desperate. The cabin was located near a tiny, practically non-existent town in the middle of nowhere. When I drove out to it, I couldn't help but feel a little excited. As the miles stretched on, the landscape around me grew more and more isolated. There were no gas stations, no billboards, no sign of civilization. It was just me, my truck, and the road winding deeper into the wilderness. The trees, dark and towering, pressed in around me. I remember feeling this strange sense of freedom, a feeling that only came from being so far removed from the world. I didn't care how long it took to get there. I didn't care about anything other than the thought of the cabin. When I finally arrived, the place was exactly as I'd imagined. Small, old, but cozy in its own way. The wooden exterior was weathered with a deep brownish hue that blended perfectly with the forest surrounding it. There was a simple porch with a couple of rocking chairs, a place where you could sit and listen to the wind rustling through the trees. Behind the cabin, the land stretched out in all directions, a patchwork of thick pines and brush. The first thing I did was walk around the cabin, taking in the view. To the north, there was a hill rising steeply, covered in moss and ferns. To the south, a thin, winding trail led deeper into the woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and I felt this wave of peace wash over me. There were no cars, no noise, just the natural hum of the forest. I hadn't realized how badly I needed this until I was standing there. The silence was almost overwhelming. It was as if the forest had swallowed up everything else. The world beyond the trees no longer existed. That first evening, I made myself dinner in the small kitchen. A simple meal. The kind of meal that didn't require much effort, just something to fill the stomach. I ate in front of the window, watching as the sky turned a deep shade of purple, the trees now little more than black silhouettes against the fading light. I could hear the occasional bird call, but other than that, it was so quiet, so incredibly quiet. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. As night settled in, I decided to take a walk around the cabin. I was eager to explore, to get a sense of the place, and maybe stretch my legs after the long drive. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out onto the porch, taking in the crisp night air. The sky above was dotted with stars, far more than I was used to seeing in the city. The moon was only a thin crescent, but the light from it filtered down through the branches of the trees, creating strange shadows on the ground. The porch creaked beneath my boots as I stepped off it, and I made my way toward the trail that led deeper into the forest. I had no real destination in mind. I just wanted to walk, to feel the solitude of the woods. The further I walked, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were packed tightly together, their trunks thick and covered in moss. I could hear the crunch of the ground beneath my feet, the soft rustle of leaves every now and then. But other than that, there was nothing. No wind, no animals, no sounds except my own movements. That's when I saw him. I wasn't expecting it. I don't even know why I was looking in that direction, but I turned to my left and saw a figure standing in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow or a tree stump, but no. It was a man, and he was standing completely still, watching me. I don't know why, but something in me immediately tensed up. The man was far enough away that I couldn't make out many details, but I could see enough to know that he wasn't supposed to be there. He was standing off the trail, just beyond the tree line, his face partially obscured by the branches of the pines. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me. His clothes were ragged, as though they hadn't been washed in days or even weeks. His shirt was torn in places, and his jeans were frayed at the edges. His hair was wild and unkempt, falling over his face in uneven strands. But what really got to me were his eyes. Even from a distance, I could feel them. They were wide open, fixed on me, and yet there was something vacant about them. Like he wasn't really looking at me, but instead staring through me into some space beyond. I stood there for what felt like forever, not sure what to do. My mind raced. Was he lost? Did he need help? But something in my gut told me not to approach. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, thicker with tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I took a step back, then another and another. The man never moved, never blinked. He just stood there, watching me. Finally, I turned around and started walking back toward the cabin. I didn't run. I don't know why. I should have, but I didn't. I just walked quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and I kept glancing over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't following me. By the time I reached the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The quietness of the forest felt different now, more oppressive, like the trees themselves were watching. I locked the door behind me and stood there for a moment, just listening. But the forest was silent again. Too silent. It was the kind of silence that feels unnatural, as if everything has stopped for just a moment. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just some guy out for a walk. Maybe he wasn't even from the area. But I couldn't forget the way he had looked at me, how his eyes seemed to see right through me. I tried to push it from my mind, but I couldn't. Not yet. That night, after I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, I thought I'd finally be able to relax. But then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a faint tapping. It was so quiet at first, I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again. Tap, 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 tap. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I lay there, listening. The sound came from the window, but there was no wind, no storm, nothing that could explain it. The tapping continued, almost in a pattern, as though someone was tapping a finger on the glass, slowly and methodically. I slowly turned my head toward the window. My breath caught in my throat as I stared out into the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the blackness of the forest pressing in around the cabin like some kind of thick, suffocating blanket. But then I heard the voice. The whisper was faint at first, almost a murmur lost in the wind. It was like someone was speaking just beyond the reach of the trees, too far to make out the words. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it came again, closer this time. The voice was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Help! I froze, my body stiff, heart thundering in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out along my forehead. My instincts screamed at me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. I couldn't even make a sound. I was paralyzed, staring out into the blackness. Help me, the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't far away. It was almost near the cabin. And it didn't sound like a cry for help. It was something else. A pleading, but also a warning. I didn't know if I should call out or run. Should I look outside? I didn't want to. Something told me that if I opened that window, I would be inviting something into my world that I wasn't ready to understand. The tapping had stopped by now, replaced by the whispers that seemed to float on the air, undisturbed by the wind. For a long moment, I just lay there, my body rigid, my eyes glued to the window, terrified to move. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, each thud like a drumbeat, drowning out everything else. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sound of something moving outside broke the silence. It was a slow, deliberate crunching sound, like someone was walking on the dead leaves and twigs that carpeted the forest floor. Heavy footsteps, slow and methodical, circling the cabin. Not fast, not hasty, but steady, as if the person, or whatever it was, had all the time in the world. My stomach dropped. I had been hoping it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but I knew it wasn't. The steps were too calculated, too human. Was it him? I didn't dare move, not even an inch. I just listened as the footsteps grew louder, closer to the cabin. Then they paused. I held my breath. The silence was unbearable. I waited for what felt like an eternity before the footsteps resumed, now at the far side of the cabin, continuing their slow, methodical circling. Then, without warning, the doorknob rattled. I almost screamed. It wasn't a soft rattle. It was forceful, like someone was actively trying to open the door. The sound of the metal twisting and turning seemed to reverberate through the walls, amplifying the panic that had already settled in my chest. I bolted upright, my body instinctively reaching for the nearest thing I could grab, my hunting knife. I didn't know if it would help, but I wasn't thinking clearly. The fear had overtaken all my reasoning. I pressed my back into the corner of the room, the knife clenched in my hands, staring at the door. Every muscle in my body was frozen, every part of me begging to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The footsteps outside continued, as if the person was pacing now, circling the cabin. My mind raced with every possible explanation. Maybe it was someone who had lost their way, a hiker, maybe a crazy person, but no, I didn't think it was that simple. There was a kind of deliberate malice in the way they moved and the way the door rattled. This wasn't someone who had just gotten lost. This was something who was watching. The minutes dragged by, every second stretching into eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The footsteps stopped, the doorknob stopped rattling, the whispering ceased. The only sound left was my own breath, shallow, panicked, and ragged. I don't know how much time passed before I dared to move, but I had to do something. I couldn't just stay there, locked in that room, waiting. Slowly, cautiously, I crept to the window again, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. I pressed my face against the cold glass and stared out into the inky blackness. The forest was still. No movement, no sign of life. I should have been relieved. I should have been glad that the threat, whatever it was, seemed to have passed. But I wasn't. I felt like I was still being watched. I backed away from the window slowly, not turning my back on it, and finally collapsed onto the couch. I could barely think straight. My body was trembling uncontrollably. I didn't dare go outside. I couldn't. I couldn't even step foot on the porch. I stayed inside for the rest of the night, every shadow in the corner of my eye making my heart leap into my throat. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, just the stress of being in a new place, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, when the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I couldn't pack up my things fast enough. I didn't wait for the day to fully unfold. I didn't care that I hadn't even made coffee or eaten breakfast. I just grabbed my things, threw them in my truck, and locked the door behind me. I didn't want to be there anymore. I wanted to be far away from that cabin, from those woods, from whatever had been watching me. When I finally made it to the nearest town, I felt like I could breathe again. I stopped at a gas station, my hands still trembling from the events of the night before. I tried to calm myself, tried to act like everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that still clung to me. I drove to the sheriff's office, not really sure what I would even tell them. Part of me thought they would dismiss it. Maybe it was just some crazy guy in the woods. Maybe I had overreacted. But when I walked in, the deputy behind the counter gave me a look that made my stomach twist. "You're not the first to say something like that," he said quietly. I stared at him, confused. He didn't elaborate, just gave me that look again. One that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't the first time someone had come to them with strange, unsettling stories about this area. They promised me they would investigate. I left the sheriff's office, but I still felt unsettled. Something told me that whatever I had just experienced wasn't over. It wasn't the end of the story. A week later, I got a call from the sheriff. They found the man. They'd tracked him down deep in the woods, not far from my cabin. He had a makeshift camp hidden away in a small clearing, and when they searched it, they found some disturbing things. The place was full of stolen belongings, clothes, wallets, camping gear, stuff that didn't belong to him. But the worst part was the shelter he'd built. It was a crude, ramshackle structure made from logs and branches. Inside, they found scraps of torn clothing, rusted knives, and something that made my stomach turn. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't want to know what else was out there. I've always been someone who craved solitude. Maybe it's because I'm a freelance photographer, working alone most of the time. The rush of city life in San Francisco, with its crowds, traffic, and endless noise, can become suffocating after a while. The constant hum of the streets, the blaring of horns, the hum of fluorescent lights in cafes, it's exhausting, both physically and mentally. I found myself needing a break, something quiet, something far away from the chaos. So when I came across this listing for a small, secluded cabin in the California woods, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to escape. The description of the place caught my attention immediately. Rustic, yet charming. No neighbors for miles, and a peaceful retreat deep in nature. The idea of being completely isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees with no one around for miles, felt almost like a dream. Just me, the forest, and my camera. The cabin wasn't fancy by any means. It wasn't some luxury resort or high-end Airbnb. No, it was simple, maybe even a little old, but that's exactly what I was looking for. I wanted to disconnect from everything. No Wi-Fi, no phone service, no distractions. It promised the kind of solitude I needed to reset. I packed my car with a few essentials, camera gear, some snacks, a sleeping bag, and of course a bottle of wine to help me unwind in the evenings. The drive out there was longer than I had expected, winding through narrow roads that slowly disappeared into the thick, dense woods. I drove for what felt like hours, the scenery shifting from cityscapes to towering trees. The air grew cooler as I went deeper into the forest, the sun sinking lower and lower in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the winding road. At some point, I lost cell service entirely, and I had to rely on the map on my phone to guide me, hoping I didn't get lost. The GPS was spotty at best, cutting in and out as I drove deeper into the wilderness. The last mile of the journey was especially eerie, dark, quiet, and surrounded by an almost oppressive silence. I didn't see another car for ages, and as the cabin came into view, I couldn't help but notice how isolated it truly was. It sat at the edge of a small clearing, dark, surrounded by tall pines that loomed like silent guardians. The cabin itself was a small, squat structure with a weathered wooden exterior that looked like it had been there for decades. The roof had patches of moss growing on it, and the wood was darkened by age. A small porch led up to the front door, which was framed by hanging ivy and vines. It didn't look like anyone had been there in a while, but that only added to its charm. To me, it was perfect. I parked my car and grabbed my bags, the weight of them feeling almost comforting after the long drive. The door creaked when I opened it, revealing a dimly lit entryway. The air inside smelled musty, like old wood and dust, but it wasn't unpleasant. The floors were creaky, the furniture was old but functional, and there was a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. The living room had a worn leather couch, an antique wooden coffee table, and a bookshelf full of old, forgotten books. There was something almost nostalgic about it, like stepping into a time capsule. I wandered through the cabin, taking in the rustic charm. The kitchen was small, with basic appliances and a wooden table in the center. The bathroom was tiny, but functional. It was clear that the cabin was built for simplicity, with nothing unnecessary. A perfect retreat, in my opinion. No distractions, no frills, just a place to unwind. As I made my way through the cabin, I noticed something odd. At the end of a narrow hallway, there was a door that seemed completely out of place. It was old, the wood warped and darkened with age, and the handle was rusty. It didn't fit with the rest of the cabin, which, while worn, seemed lived in. This door, though, looked like it had been untouched for years. I wasn't sure what it was, maybe just a closet, a small storage room, but there was something about it that made me pause. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt like it didn't belong. I walked over to it, reaching for the handle, curious about what might be inside. But when I tried to turn it, the handle didn't budge. It was stuck, jammed, maybe, or locked. I gave it a harder turn, pushing against the door, but it refused to open. I shook the handle a little, but it didn't give. I frowned, wondering if there might be something blocking it on the other side, or if the lock had just gotten old and stuck over the years. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. It was almost as though something about that door was holding me back, something that didn't want me to open it. I shrugged it off, feeling silly for getting worked up over a simple door. I wasn't here to investigate the house. I was here to relax, to get away from everything. I turned away, trying to push the nagging feeling out of my mind. But the feeling stayed with me. The door felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd think much about on a normal day, but for some reason, this door was different. That night, I settled in. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees. It was loud, making the cabin creak with each gust. The howling wind seemed to echo through the small space, a constant, unsettling noise that made everything feel a little more alive. I tried to focus on my photography work, taking a few pictures of the surrounding woods before the sunset. The sky was darkening quickly, the stars starting to twinkle faintly above. Dinner was simple, just some pasta I'd cooked up quickly. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle at first, the kind of feeling you get when you're alone for too long. I tried to ignore it, reminding myself that I was just overthinking things. After I ate, I cleaned up and decided to take a shower, hoping it would help me relax. But even as I stood in the bathroom, the sound of the wind outside seemed to get louder, almost deafening. The old wooden walls creaked, groaned, and popped as if the cabin itself was shifting, adjusting to the gusts of wind. The entire structure felt alive, like it was breathing along with the wind. When I finally finished and climbed into bed, I tried to settle in. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, though it was old, and the sheets smelled like they hadn't been washed in a while. I snuggled into the blankets, hoping the warmth would chase away the lingering feeling of unease. But I couldn't get comfortable. My mind kept drifting back to that door at the end of the hallway. The wind howled outside, the trees shaking in the night, but there was something else. A faint sound. It was subtle at first, like a soft, distant whisper that I couldn't quite place. I lay there in the dark, straining to hear. It wasn't the wind, it was too rhythmic, too steady. Breathing. It was almost as if someone was breathing behind that door, slow and deliberate. My heart began to pound in my chest. I rolled over and tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket higher around my shoulders, but the sound didn't stop. It continued, steady, almost methodical. I couldn't make it out exactly, but it was unmistakable now. The breathing came from behind the door. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, the wind playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The sound was too deliberate, too precise. I lay there for what felt like hours, wide awake, listening to that slow, rhythmic breathing, just waiting for something to happen. The night dragged on. I couldn't seem to shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. The breathing, though faint, still echoed in my ears. At times, it almost seemed to stop entirely, as if whatever was behind that door was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something, anything, to make a move. Then, just when I thought I could convince myself it was nothing, the rhythmic exhale would start again, like it had never stopped. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to sleep, but the sound wouldn't let me. My mind kept racing. What if someone was inside the cabin with me? The thought made my heart race, but I quickly dismissed it. I was being paranoid. The place was locked up tight, and I was alone, just as I had planned. No one else could be here. But still, the breath lingered. By morning, I was exhausted. I barely slept, the sound of breathing haunting my every thought. I dragged myself out of bed and tried to shake it off. The sun was just beginning to filter through the trees, casting light into the cabin's windows, and I decided that maybe a long hike would help clear my head. I needed to get away from the cabin, from the door, from the weird feeling that wouldn't leave me. I left the cabin, locking the door behind me. The cool morning air was refreshing, and as I stepped onto the dirt path that led into the woods, I could feel my body slowly unwind. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling out in the distance, the rustling of leaves, the crunch of the earth beneath my boots. It felt good to breathe in the fresh air, to leave the cabin and that strange feeling behind for a while. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing taller and more dense, blocking out most of the sunlight. I found myself moving further than I had intended, lost in my thoughts, snapping pictures of the landscape. The forest had this eerie stillness to it, though, as if it was watching me too. Every now and then, a bird would flutter by, or a branch would snap somewhere in the distance, but it felt like the woods were holding their breath, just like the cabin had been. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just the quiet, the isolation. I'd been alone too long. But no matter how much I tried to reassure myself, that creeping feeling stayed with me, like something was just on the edge of my vision, waiting to step into the frame. I hiked for a couple of hours, my boots crunching over the pine needles, but eventually I decided to head back. The cabin still seemed far off in the distance, but my legs were aching from the trek. The sunlight was starting to fade, and I knew it would be dark soon. I needed to get back, if only to settle my mind. When I returned to the cabin, it felt oddly still. Too still. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the solitude getting to me again, but as I opened the door, I immediately noticed that something was off. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A chair in the kitchen was slightly pulled back from the table, as though someone had just gotten up from it. I didn't leave the chair like that. I was certain of it. I froze in the doorway, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. My eyes darted around the room. The kitchen table, which had been perfectly set with the dishes I left behind, was now disheveled, the chair askew. My bag, which I had left on the couch, was now placed on the floor, tucked against the wall. It was almost as if someone had been in here, moving things around. I walked inside, my steps slow and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, ensuring they were secure. I was alone, I reminded myself. No one had been here. I was just imagining things. But that nagging feeling wouldn't leave. I kept running my hands over the doorknobs, checking the windows, making sure everything was as it should be. I even checked the door at the end of the hallway, the one that had been jammed the night before. I reached for the handle, almost expecting it to open this time, but it didn't. It was still locked or stuck, I couldn't tell. I pulled harder, my fingers aching as I twisted the knob, but nothing happened. I let out a shaky breath and pulled away from the door. What was I doing? I was being paranoid. It was just a cabin in the woods. There was no one here but me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked everything one more time, windows, doors, the locks, before I finally resigned myself to the fact that I was going to have to spend another night in this place. But it wasn't going to be easy. I couldn't stop thinking about the door. The sound of breathing still echoed in my mind. That night, I decided to double-check my locks again, just to feel safe. I pushed a chair under the doorknob to the front door, just in case. It felt silly, but it made me feel a little more secure. I pulled the blankets tight around me in bed, still feeling that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The wind howled outside, the cabin creaking and groaning under the pressure of the storm that had picked up during the evening. It sounded like the forest itself was trying to get inside. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, my flashlight within reach. The wind outside grew louder, the howl almost becoming a scream, and I found myself listening, waiting for that sound again. The breathing, the door. Suddenly, at exactly 2:17 a.m., a sharp noise cut through the silence, a slow, deliberate creak, like wood bending under weight. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest as I lay perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, this time unmistakably from the hallway. The door. I didn't move, not even an inch. My mind raced, my breath catching in my throat. The wind was still howling outside, but the creaking, it was different now. It was closer. Then a horrible thought struck me. What if someone had been here all along? The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the cabin itself was holding its breath along with me. And then there was a sound so violent, so loud, it shattered the silence. Bang! The door slammed open with the force of a thunderclap, the wood splintering as it burst inward. The door slammed open with such force that the entire cabin shook, and for a split second I couldn't even process what was happening. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay frozen in bed, staring at the dark hallway, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then I saw him. A man, filthy, wild-eyed, and disheveled, lunged into the room. He was tall, almost skeletal, his face covered in dirt, his clothes ragged and torn. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a chill straight through me. I could see his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body shaking as though he hadn't eaten in days, maybe weeks. In his hand, he gripped a knife, long, serrated, gleaming silver in the dim light. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed with terror. This wasn't some random break-in. No, this man had been here. He had been living here, hiding just beyond that door, waiting for the moment when I would finally let my guard down. My body jerked into action before I even realized what I was doing. I rolled off the bed, landing hard on the floor as the knife swiped through the air, missing me by inches. I scrambled for my flashlight, my hands shaking violently as I fumbled with it. The beam of light finally flickered to life, and I threw it toward his face. The bright, blinding light hit him directly, causing him to stumble back, momentarily disoriented. It was enough. I didn't hesitate. My feet hit the floor, and without thinking, I bolted for the door. I slammed into the wooden frame with all my weight, my pulse deafening in my ears. The man roared behind me, his voice a guttural growl as he scrambled to catch up. I didn't dare look back. The night was pitch black, and the trees closed in around me like a living wall, their branches scraping against my skin as I sprinted through the woods. My breath came in ragged gasps, and every step I took felt like it might be my last. The darkness seemed to press in on me, swallowing everything around me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I pushed myself harder, further, until finally I emerged from the trees and onto the road. A truck was coming down the narrow road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Without thinking, I waved my arms, screaming for help. The trucker slammed on the brakes, pulling over as I collapsed onto the ground in exhaustion. The driver, a gruff middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, leapt out of the truck. "What the hell happened to you? Are you okay?" His voice was full of concern, but my heart was racing too fast for me to form coherent words. I need to get out of here, please." I managed to stammer, my voice trembling. He didn't hesitate. He helped me into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind me. I thought about the door, the one I had tried so hard to ignore. It had been the door to his secret. He'd been living in the cabin the entire time. Had he been watching me from behind it? Was he waiting for the perfect moment to strike? My mind raced with questions, each one more disturbing than the last. The trucker called the police as we reached the nearest town. The police arrived not long after. They began investigating immediately. They drove back to the cabin with me. But when they arrived, the place was empty. The man was gone. But the police found evidence that told a much darker story. They discovered hidden supplies, canned food, clothes, and other items that showed the man had been living there for weeks, maybe even longer. It didn't take long for them to track him down. They found him a few days later, hiding in a nearby shack. The man was arrested and taken into custody, his wild eyes never leaving mine as he was led away in handcuffs. I don't know what was worse, the fact that he had been living there the entire time, or the cold emptiness in his gaze as he stared at me. The police assured me that I was safe now, that everything would be fine. But I didn't feel safe. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about how close I had come to being trapped in that cabin with him. It's been months since it all happened, but the memory still haunts me.